Hello there, listeners. Welcome to Mr. Liddle's History Bites. You are listening to Two Ends of Asia. In 1890, a ship wrecked in a typhoon off the coast of Japan. The ship was old, and 4 days of heavy winds saw the ship literally disintegrating. Water poured in from all sides and wrecked the hull. The ship split into two, and the pieces of the ship smashed into a nearby cliff. Of the crew of more than 500, over 430 perished. This is the sad fate of the Ottoman frigate Tugrul, which wrecked on its journey back from Japan to the Ottoman capital of Istanbul. Its fate is well known, but perhaps less clear is that the journey encapsulates the relationship between the two major powers in Asia in the late 1800s, the Ottoman Empire and the Empire of Japan. And its fate also brings into questions notions of legitimacy on the world stage throughout history. By the late 1800s, the situation of two of the largest states in Asia, the Ottoman Empire and the Empire of Japan, seemed to stand in stark contrast. The Ottoman Empire was being then described as the sick man of Europe, beset with internal nationalist movements in the Balkans wanting to break away from it, and external threats, such as Russia wanting to take advantage of its weakness to grab territory, and France, who was making claims upon protecting the Christians in the Ottoman Empire. Radicals within the empire wanted to strip power from the Sultan and build a constitution, while other groups wanted to give the Sultan more power. It was a crazy time. Japan, by contrast, under the newly empowered Emperor Meiji, seemed to be industrializing their textile industry, building a modern army and navy, smashing their feudal system, though not without a small rebellion, sending out people to learn about Europe and the United States via the Iwakura mission, and in the stroke of a pen, rewriting their entire political system to create a constitution that resembled that of Britain and the United States. But a closer examination shows these two states were actually not so different. Both states, or elements within the state, sought to adopt industrial technology and a Western legal system in order to strengthen, first and foremost, their militaries. The Ottomans, in particular, wanted to prevent a growing Russia from taking any more territory after several key defeats and barely being saved by the British and the French in the Crimean War of the 1850s. Both states had signed agreements that surrendered elements of their sovereignty to European powers and the United States, forcing economic concessions, the capitulations in the Ottoman Empire, and the unequal treaties in Japan. These were designed to give foreign countries a trade advantage within these countries, such as exemptions from taxes or even exemptions from local laws. And while it should be noted that this was actually a long-standing policy within the Ottoman Empire to encourage trade, once the Ottoman Empire lost military dominance over Eastern Europe and their own backyard, this turned into a distinct disadvantage. And both states had elements within that sought to reform the state. The young Emperor Meiji and his supporters in Japan who took control, and the Young Turks, also known as the Committee of Union and Progress, who eventually took control of the government of the Ottoman Empire in 1908. Emperor Meiji, who took the throne after the restoration of imperial power from the shogun, a kind of military dictator, in an event known as the Meiji Restoration, was initially supported by those in the government who wanted to reject the encroaching Western powers. But these groups soon realized the value of adapting to the outside world. The Young Turks were a group of intellectuals, military officers, and politicians, most of whom were quite old, actually, and whose goal was to limit the power of the Sultan and build the state with a European-style constitution. Both the Young Turks and the government of the Ottoman Empire felt like Japan should be emulated in an effort to strengthen the Ottoman Empire and prevent its disintegration. Writing in 1897, a spokesman for the Ottoman government said, "The Japanese government, adorned with great intelligence and ideological firmness and progress, has attempted to secure and develop Japan's capacity for advancement by using means to serve the needs of their society." And similarly, a young Turk writing from exile in France in 1902 wrote, "We should take note of Japan, this nation that has become rivals with the great powers. One should pay attention to that nation not separating public spirit and the good of its homeland from life. It certainly preserves its national independence. The Japanese successes are a product of their patriotic zeal." These two quotes demonstrate that both government and reformer alike were taking note of Japan's definitive and drastic changes. And so, with the desire to develop closer ties between Japan and the Ottoman Empire, the frigate Tugrul set sail in 1889 for Japan on a goodwill mission. Upon arrival in Japan a year later, the Ottoman officials toured factories, saw military parades, and generally learned about Japan. No doubt, Ottoman officials were impressed and wished to duplicate the success of Japan back in the Ottoman Empire. However, the journey is just as interesting as the destination. The Tugrul journeyed to Japan via the Indian Ocean basin, stopping in places such as Aden, Calcutta, Sri Lanka, Malacca, and Singapore, before making its way to Japan. It was in these stops that the ship was greeted by large crowds who proclaimed their appreciation for the ship's visit. It demonstrated the still lasting influence of the Ottoman Empire as a symbol in these regions of the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia. For you see, the Tugrul was not the first time an Ottoman naval vessel had voyaged into the Indian Ocean. In the mid-16th century, a number of Ottoman naval expeditions had been launched into the Indian Ocean to assert the authority of the Sultan in this region, and at the behest of local Islamic leaders, in places such as Gujarat in India or Aceh in modern Sumatra. These rulers wanted alliances with the Ottoman Empire, as it would give them a bulwark against the increasingly aggressive Portuguese, who were making their presence felt in the Indian Ocean at this time, following the voyages of Vasco da Gama. One of the initial reasons the Ottomans found it worth their while to be involved in the Indian Ocean basin was to protect the pilgrimage ships coming from East Africa and India to make the Hajj to Mecca via the Red Sea. As it underlines the authority of the Ottoman Empire in the 1500s, it was viewed throughout much of the Muslim world as a religious authority, in part because the Sultan also held the title of Caliph after 1530. Caliph is a religious and political title that was held by some of the first companions of the Prophet Muhammad following his passing. Traditionally, the Caliph had been viewed as the leader of the Muslim world, and while this may not have been true for all Muslims, at this time in history, the Sultan was definitely viewed with a great deal of awe and wonder by much of the Islamic world. This legitimacy and sense of wonder led to other smaller powers in the Indian Ocean to appeal to help to defeat the infidel Portuguese. On two occasions, Ottoman naval forces repulsed Portuguese attempts to take control of the Red Sea, helping to maintain the Ottoman naval dominance of that region and protecting the Islamic holy city of Mecca. Even the name of the ship Tugrul reflects this history. According to Ottoman history, Tugrul was the name of the father of Osman, the founder of the Ottoman Empire, and Tugrul himself was a Ghazi, or a holy warrior for Islam, a title that he proved by fighting the neighboring Christian Byzantine Empire. But the Ottomans' protective moves also reflected some of what we might call good old-fashioned power diplomacy. A letter from the Aceh ambassador to the Ottoman Empire in 1547 reads in part, "Would your Majesty the Sultan, if you send a navy with the necessary weapons and cannons to this side, we promise that the Portuguese can be destroyed. The rulers in this part and in India wish to obtain the assistance of you against the Portuguese. Would your Majesty please send some cannons, which we can destroy the castles of the Portuguese?" To sweeten the deal, the ambassador also included a number of gifts, such as spices, gold, and other precious stones, and a promise of increased trade between the two states. And the Ottomans did attempt to send a fleet to Aceh, but political changes in Aceh ended any request for aid. And by the 17th century, the troubles at the center of the Ottoman Empire were leading to a neglect of the Ottoman navy in the Indian Ocean. You see, prior to the construction of the Suez Canal, it was incredibly difficult to build a fleet in the Red Sea region. Lacking local timber supplies, everything had to be brought in overland from another part of the empire. Gradually, as the Ottomans neglected this region, the Europeans took control of the Indian Ocean, and by the late 1800s, no part of the Indian Ocean basin was in effect outside of European control. The military and technological dominance of the Ottomans' rivals was itself seen in the frigate Tugrul, which, while it was built in the Ottoman Empire, had its steam engine and electrical lights installed in the United Kingdom. But by the time of the voyage, the Tugrul itself was long out of date. The ship was made out of wood and had traditional masts and sails, while at the same time, Germany and the United Kingdom were beginning a naval arms race that saw the rise of the steel dreadnought-class battleship, which dominated naval warfare for the next 50 years. As mentioned before, Japan by the late 1800s was rising to compete with the European powers, This was even more impressive considering the 200-plus years of limited contact with the outside world. Though the period from the 1600s to the 1800s is sometimes referred to as a period of isolation, this is somewhat of a misnomer. Japan did continue to have limited contact with the Western powers. But by 1890, the Japanese had managed to renegotiate and end their unequal treaties with most European powers. Japan had also smashed the ailing Qing dynasty in China in a question of who had influence over Korea, and in the process took over control of Taiwan, turning it into a colony. Topping it all off was the Anglo-Japanese Naval Alliance of 1902, which put Japan on an equal footing with the premier naval power of the world. Japan was the shining star in the minds of not just the Young Turks and the Ottoman government, but in the minds of nationalists and revolutionaries all over Asia, and even India. From the Filipino freedom fighter Mario Ponce to the Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore, revolutionaries took both literal and poetic refuge in Japan as the bulwark against Western imperialism in Asia. Japan's reputation would be even more enhanced after the Japanese defeat of Russia and the destruction of the entire Russian fleet in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. Sun Yat-sen, the Chinese revolutionary who would overthrow the Qing dynasty, proclaimed in a 1924 speech, which he gave in Japan itself, "The day when the unequal treaties were abolished by Japan was the day of regeneration for all Asiatic peoples. After the abolition of the unequal treaties, Japan became the first independent country in Asia. The remaining countries such as China, India, Persia, Afghanistan, Arabia, and Turkey were not independent. That is to say, they were still dominated and treated as colonies by Europe." If you were a young revolutionary looking to resist European influence in the late 19th century, or you were a young nationalist who wanted to build your nation and unify it, then you looked to Japan as your example. To bring this back to the bigger picture, most popular world histories depict Japan as the successful example of the country that embraced the outside world, sent off its youth to learn about the outside world, and therefore succeeded in adapting to the outside world, where other nations failed. For example, the Ottoman Empire, at this same time, was exiling or executing a number of its young, modernizing intellectuals. The Japanese sank an entire Russian fleet, while the Ottoman Navy could not even manage a simple goodwill trip. Those individuals from the frigate Tugrul who survived the wreckage of their ship had to be taken back to Istanbul in a Japanese battleship. However, this narrative is not entirely true. The Young Turks and their projects to modernize the Ottoman Empire very much mirror Japanese efforts, if less successful. The Young Turks wanted the center of the empire's identity to be on a politically limited sultan and a strictly Turkish identity, much like how the emperor had become a new symbol for the Japanese empire. The difficulties of the Young Turks should not be seen in default as failure, as the new Japanese Emperor Meiji faced several revolts around his government's efforts to transform Japan. What if the young Emperor Meiji had failed to suppress these revolts? Context is always important, and it's important to consider the wider context of the Ottoman Empire and Japan at the same time. And these two states also raise interesting questions about how legitimacy as a world power can be constructed over time. Earlier in world history, the Ottoman Empire was seen as a world leader in Asia, in part because of the spiritual position of the Sultan, and those states seeking to build their own legitimacy or resist outside influence sought to make ties with the Ottomans, and the Ottoman Empire continued to make claims on this legitimacy even as late as World War I, calling for a jihad against the British and sending agents into India to stir up a revolt. But by the 19th century, Japan, with its ability to master the economic and political structure of the Western nations, made them the nation to look for those seeking to build states or resist outside influence. Despite these differences, some things do remain constant. In both cases, it was only the political and military power of both states that allowed them to extend their influence beyond their own borders, be that the Japanese defeat of Russia or the Ottoman defeat of Portuguese fleets in the Indian Ocean. But the sending of an outdated and poorly conditioned frigate halfway around the world and losing it in a storm is as clear as indication of any that the military prowess had passed from the Ottoman Empire and was to be taken up by the Empire of Japan. The story of the frigate Tugrul is interesting, not only because it symbolizes the connection between these two Asian states in an age of transition, but its tragic fate asks us to consider the sources of legitimacy in world history and how this can be shaped and changes over time. I hope you've enjoyed this bite of history. I hope you've learned something, but I also hope you walk away with more questions. Thank you for joining me.